All right. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by sharing a popular quote that is attributed to one of our greats, the great Chinua Achebe, that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Well, I hate to begin by saying that I disagree with the spirit in which that statement was made. And of course, anyone who knows me knows very well that I have deep and profound respect for a man I consider my father, my idol. He is a great African, the great Chinua Achebe. Of course, I agree with the statement. I mean, the statement itself is correct in the sense that if the lion doesn't write about the hunt, the narrative will always reflect the side of the hunter. That fact is clear. I mean, I am not disputing with that. But what I disagree with, again, is the spirit in which it is made. What do I mean by that? You see, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. That statement is premised on the idea that Africans were not writing already. That statement was couched on the notion that we had just started writing. That is what I disagree with, the spirit in which that statement was made. Because when we check into history, it is clear that Africans have been writing. We have been writing. So if you permit me, I like to maybe make a mild insertion or an adjustment to the statement by saying that it's not that the lions have not been writing. It's not that the lions did not have historians. The problem is that we have not been reading the history that the lions wrote. That's it. We have not been reading it. I'm sorry to burst your bubble. I'm sorry to come off as if I am accusing you, but I am coming off strong here because I also began reading very recently about my own history. And guess what? It is not your fault, and it's not my fault that the history of the lions were not made available to us. I don't want to delve into the details here, but you understand what I'm saying. Africans have been writing. If I ask you here who knows about the 10 Commandments, everybody here will raise their hand. The 10 Commandments. Probably written about 2,000 or more so years ago. thou shalt not, thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt. That's the way in which it was written. Africans had produced a text upon which the 10 Commandments probably was based upon. The 42 laws of Ma'at. I didn't know this growing up. You probably didn't know this. It was written in the negative format, as opposed to thou shalt, thou shalt. It was written as thou shalt not, thou shalt not. 42 laws of Ma'at, written well over 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years before the Bible was even written, before the Hebrew Bible was written. So please don't tell me Africans didn't have any text. Don't tell me Africans have not been writing. We have been writing. So it's not that the lions did not have historians. The problem is we have not been reading the history written by the lions. The history is there. We just have not been reading it. It's there waiting for us to enter, to engage, to enjoy, and to share. And like I said, I am not blaming anybody, any African, that for not being aware of our own history. I'm not. You know, I've come into this quite recently. This should be part of who we are, part of our socialization, part of our growing up. It should be. Unfortunately, our history has been hidden from us. Our history has been erased. Our history is not taught in the curriculum. Okay, so let me jump in here. You might ask, okay, what are we talking about here? So let me go ahead and share my screen briefly and sort of give you an idea where this notion that Africans did not have a history came from. Okay, let me do that. I think hopefully that would set the stage for our discussion today. Okay. All right. And please give me a thumb up if you can see my slides. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. So this is where all this began, this notion that we didn't have history. There was a German philosopher in the 1700s who postulated in a lecture that Africans lacked reason, that we couldn't think. Okay, so this man's name was Hegel. You may have heard about him. And reason being the fundamental law of the world, he said, because Africans lack reason, they also lack history, culture, development, and philosophy. He believes that African history does not represent development of the spirit's consciousness of freedom. And he called Africa the dark continent. In other words, Africans were not free enough to think for themselves, to ponder, to wonder, to meditate. Okay. So he pushed the idea of European supremacy. But most importantly, he even advanced that the Germans were more superior than anybody else. Okay. So, he said that this idea of freedom this idea of the manifestation of the spirit, which is freedom, was littered in the Germanic people, that you could find it in the Germanic people, but not in Africans, because Africans lack reason. They can't think. This is where this is coming from. Now, he did say, however, that, that there were some philosophers, some Western philosophers that predated this idea of German supremacy. He gave credit to the Greeks. He gave credit to the Romans. He said that consciousness of freedom first arose among the Greeks, and therefore that they are free. He went on to talk about the Chinese. He said the Chinese morals and Indian religion represent only intuition, and it's not about thinking, it's not rationale. And that the two nations, China and India, lacked completely the essential consciousness of the concept of freedom. In other words, they had a semblance of philosophical thought, but they were not quite there. So essentially he put Germans on the very top, followed by other Europeans, and then he gave some credit, to Chinese and to Indians, even though he said because theirs were not quite really there. But for Africa, there's nothing. He said the Africans completely lack reason. Okay. So that was what he advanced, Hegel. Now, what happened? What was the repercussion, the ripple effect of this kind of thinking? Well, Western scholars followed suit. They jumped on it. And they started publishing works based on that. So here are some of the names of people who built on this idea that Africans didn't have a philosophy, that Africans weren't thinkers, that the African mind wasn't the first to ponder the universe. They didn't talk about those things. Okay. So you have words like primitive society beginning now to be associated with Africans, primitive people. Our religion is primitive, our art is primitive, our money is primitive, our mind is primitive. So this idea of primitive, this, primitive, that, flourished. It began with Hegel. And then on the American side, they invented the term third world. And I'd like to please ask you all to never call yourself or your people or your country third world, unless you are subscribing to this notion that you are indeed in the third place, or you are subhuman. I tried, not even I tried, I no longer use the term third world. It's very derogatory, demeaning, condescending, dehumanizing. That's where it began, third world country, right? And sometimes they say underdeveloped. How would you tell me I'm underdeveloped? What does that mean to be underdeveloped? Just because you have structures, you have modern structures, does that make you a developed person or a developed society? What if we start looking at development based on humanity, which is really, in my opinion, how we should be measuring civilization, respect for life, and dignity and freedom. In America today, slavery is still flourishing. The 13th Amendment was adjusted. It abolished slavery, but there's an exception, and it still stands today. On American soil, if you are a criminal, you can be a slave based on the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. You can be a slave if you are a criminal. So does that sound like civilization to you? Does that sound like an advancement to own other people as slaves, to enslave them? Anyway, but here's where it's coming from. Again, it has real underpinnings from Hegel, that Africans didn't have history, we didn't have philosophy, we didn't have anything. And so later on down the road, anthropologists began to, when they study Africa and they encounter African beliefs, they started basically categorizing things that are African, putting in a different category. It is African belief, it is African religion or African worldview, right? It's African system of thought, or it's tribal art. Ethno-philosophy is philosophical thought, not quite philosophy, which is reasoning, is somewhat philosophical. In other words, it's not quite there. So that is what we are facing. And that is where all these came from. This idea that Africans didn't have history. And it gets worse. It gets worse. Today, you may have heard about IQ tests. That is another way now that they've invented to discredit our intelligence as Africans. You have heard of the IQ test. So they began administering the IQ test in Africa and in the US, and they found that Americans or Europeans tend to score higher on the IQ test compared to Africans. And because of that, they said Africans, African Americans, or people of African descent lack intelligence and cognitive capabilities of their European counterparts. That is still going on till today, even though research has clearly debunked this idea of using the IQ test. Because number one, the IQ test only measures a maximum 3 aspects of intelligence, number one. And number two, it's very culturally loaded. It might be skewed, right? It's very skewed to the cultural norms of Europeans or people with European ancestry. So because I wonder if, what will happen if we were to develop an IQ test based on Yoruba philosophy or based on Yoruba worldview. I wonder how many people would do well on that IQ test. But anyway, it's been debunked. And the research is clear on that. You cannot use that, the IQ test, to make judgments on who is more intelligent than the other. But this has been ongoing for a long time. You may know this face. I shared this last week when I was giving a talk. James Watson, the man who co-discovered DNA, this is what he said. He said that there's a difference on the average IQ test between blacks and whites. And he said that difference is genetic. You see, this is in recent times. This is as recent as 2007, he said, inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all the testing says not really. He continues to say that people who have dealt with Black employees find that Black employees are not equal to white employees. So this is what we are dealing with today. Now, let me take you back a little bit just to the 20th century. There was a time when Europeans were clamoring to have it such that the first humans, that it could be said that the first humans arose from Europe. Okay, in the 20th century, not too long ago, there was a big push. It was like a rush to make it such that it can be said in history that first humans was an Englishman after all. So this push led to several people looking for human fossils in Europe. They were looking. And then in 1912, a man by the name of Charles Dawson, shown right here, presented a skull from somewhere in Sussex, England. Presented that skull to Arthur Smith Woodward. And both of them collaborated and said, you know what, here's the skull. This skull is the first human that ever lived. Meanwhile, what they did was, or what he did, Charles Dawson, was he took a skull of a gorilla and filed the teeth, manipulated the skull, painted it a little bit big to make it look like it was like the first human that came from, you know, our ape cousins, so that he can now be said that the first, after all, the first human was an Englishman. And the way they made this work was they also had like an elephant bones shaped like a cricket bat next to it, trying to essentially put in the minds of people that, wow, the first human who was British or who was an Englishman actually came out swinging with a bat. They were already playing cricket as early as whenever, 500,000 years ago. This is what happened in history. But of course, 41 years later, it was debunked. Scientists now went back and actually looked at the skull and now found this was a hoax. But a lot of people piled on. There was some skepticism, no doubt. But in the end, it was debunked. Of course, we know the first humans are Africans. Science tells us that. Paleontology tells us that. That's something we ought to be celebrating. That the birthplace of humanity is Africa. Right? So I thought I should, before even delving into African history, some of these aspects of our history, who is the first multi-genius? Who is the first woman doctor or medical practitioner? Before we delve into all those things, the first philosopher, I wanted to set the stage to let us know where all this is coming from. To let us understand the reason why it seems as if we didn't have a history, and all the work that's been done to make it seem like we as Africans did not have history. That's where it's coming from. So that next time we discuss, we can now delve into what these aspects are. I mentioned a little bit about the 42 laws of Ma'at. We're going to delve into that. We're going to delve into all our Egyptian, our Kemetic connections. We're going to look at African achievements and have an engagement with those things.